All right, this is the recording for our first lab. So, orientation to the human body. And it's all based on information from chapter 1. So, the first thing we'll talk about is anatomic position. An anatomic position is just the way that we assume that people are standing. It's a common reference position. And in anatomic position, we assume that the person that we're describing is standing up with their palms facing forward. Feet are parallel and flat on the floor. Upper limbs are at the sides of the body, and head is level and eyes are looking forward. So, in anatomic position, we can use specific directional terms to describe relative positions. And so, there are a lot of opposing pairs that we'll talk about. So, anterior is going to mean towards the front of the body in anatomic position. Posterior means towards the back of the body in anatomic position. Dorsal means towards the belly, dorsal means towards the back, whereas ventral means towards the belly. In humans who are bipedal and stand upright, usually anterior and ventral are synonymous. We use them fairly interchangeably, and posterior and dorsal are synonymous. We also use those fairly interchangeably. They are a little bit different in quadrupedal animals that, stand differently, but for our purposes, we generally use anterior and ventral as almost the same, and posterior and dorsal can be used interchangeably. Proximal and distal is another one that can be a little bit confusing. So this is used on the limbs, so usually the arms and the legs mainly. And so proximal means closer to the point of attachment to the body, so like closer to the shoulder or closer to the hip, I think in close proximity to the body. Whereas distal means it's further, it's more distant from the point of attachment to the body, so like the fingers are distal. There is a whole chart in your book, so I'm going to refer you to that. We'll also talk about superior, which means, above, inferior is below, medial means towards the midline, lateral means away from the midline, superficial means towards the outside of the body, whereas deep is deeper in, underneath, inside the body, so the skin is superficial, the muscle is deep. And so there are lots of important terms that we'll use often in our anatomy. And there is a really good interactive learning activity that you guys can watch. So I have 3 or 4 of these. They're going to be linked in the PowerPoint as well as they're linked in your lab. And so I would, that's something that you guys should do to practice using anatomical terms. And it has little presentation and then some practice problems for you guys. There's also a bunch of practice problems in the lab practical for you, in the lab manual for you guys to do. So these are just, this, I didn't show you a picture earlier. This is anatomic position here. So he is standing with his arms by his side, his palms are facing forward, his feet are flat on the ground and parallel, his toes pointing forward, and his head is looking straight and his eyes are forward. So this is anatomic position here. And so as you can see, whenever we talk about positions and we describe all of these things, we're describing them based on anatomic position. So there are also some important anatomic terms that you need to learn for different regions of the body. And this is going to be important clinically because if someone, asks you to, take an axillary temperature or something, you need to know where the axilla is. And so we're going to go through and kind of talk about a bunch of the different regions in the body. So first we'll talk about 2 main regions, and we'll use this a lot. We'll talk about our axial and appendicular regions. So the axial region is the head, the neck, and the trunk. This is like the main vertical axis of the body. When we start learning about the bones and the muscles, we're going to divide, especially the bones, into the axial bones in one lab, and we'll learn about the appendicular bones in another lab. We also have 2 labs for the muscles, the axial and appendicular muscles. So the appendicular region is going to be the upper and lower limbs. So I think of them as the appendages, right? The appendages are the arms and legs, the upper and lower limbs. And there are many, many more regions within these 2 main ones. So if you look in our lab folder, you can see, as well as your book, obviously, but I put the picture from the book in our lab folder, and I've also put a blank one so you guys can practice labeling it if you want. There's another online body regions interactive tutorial you guys can do, as well as some practice activities in the lab manual. So there are lots and lots of different regions here. So you guys are going to have to memorize these regions. I will be asking you questions about them on the lab practical. You can use some of the practice questions in the lab manual to help remember, as well as those online interactives. It's important to know what all these terms mean because it will help you later in this class as well as clinically. So for example, right here, the deltoid region is the shoulder region. This muscle here that underlies this region is called the deltoid muscle. So if you already know the deltoid region, it'll be easier to remember the deltoid muscle. So this region right here, the femoral region, which is the thigh, the bone that's right under here is the femur. So if you know that it's the femoral region, it'll be easy to know the name of that bone, which is the femur. The patellar region right here, or the kneecap, the bone there is the patella. The calcaneal region or calcaneal region, which is the heel, well, the big bone that makes up your heel is the calcaneus. So there's lots and lots of different, same with the sternal region. The bone that's underlying here is the sternum. And it's also important because, like, as we said before, if you are told to take an axillary temperature, it's important and good to know that the axilla, or the axillary area, is the armpit. So you know, oh, well, I need to, take a temperature in the armpit. And so it's important to know these clinically as well as for the lab practical and for your lab quiz. We also have some anatomical terms on the back. So there are quite a few of them that you guys should be familiar with. This one right here, another good example, the olecranon or elbow, is because the olecranon process is right here, and we'll learn that in our appendicular skeletal lab. So by learning these now, it will help you with things like learning the muscles and bones later. The occipital, or part of the back part of the head, is because there's an occipital bone right there. So all of these are pretty important. Vertebral, or the spinal column, all of your vertebrae run right through here. So not all of them are going to be exactly related to the bones or muscles, but it is pretty helpful. So the next thing we're going to mention is body cavities and membranes. And so these body cavities are internal spaces within the body that house organs. And so these body cavities that we're going to be talking about are not open to the outside. And so they're like your abdomen, your thorax, your cranial cavity, which encloses your brain. And so they're going to hold internal organs, and they are not open to the outside. And they're going to be grouped into the posterior aspect and the ventral cavity. And so, as I said, posterior and dorsal are pretty synonymous. So some people call it the dorsal aspect or the dorsal cavity. And then ventral and anterior can be fairly synonymous too. But we'll go with what the terminology the book uses. So with posterior and ventral aspect and ventral cavity. Once again, there's another online interactive you guys can do about body cavities. I recommend doing them. They're pretty helpful. So the posterior aspect is the first one we'll talk about, and this is going to be the back part here. It's going to include the cranial cavity, which encloses the brain, as well as the vertebral or spinal cavity, which encloses the spinal cord. These actually develop differently from the ventral cavities, and they are completely encased in bone, right? Because remember that the brain and the spinal cord are part of the nervous system, and they are very delicate. And so the bone is going to help protect them. They're also going to be enclosed by special membranes called the meninges. And these meninges are going to encase them, and they're filled with cerebrospinal fluid. But we're going to talk more about those in chapter 13, so we're not going to focus too much on this class, or in this chapter. So as we said, the posterior aspect is subdivided into the cranial cavity that houses the brain and the vertebral canal that houses the spinal cord. So let's see, that's going to be the cranial cavity right here. So we've got the cranial cavity where the brain is, and the vertebral canal, which houses the spinal cord. And you can see how they're encased in bone. The next cavity is the ventral cavities. That's all of the stuff in the front part here that is not completely encased in bone. So the ventral cavity is actually larger, and it's a little more complicated. It has more, there's more stuff in it, more organs in the ventral cavity. And it can be partitioned into a superior thoracic cavity and an inferior abdominopelvic cavity. And these are going to be divided right here by the diaphragms. The diaphragm is a big muscle that's important in breathing, but it also is important in dividing the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. So these body cavities here in the ventral cavities are going to be filled with body organs, and they're actually going to be lined with what's called serous membranes. And so the serous membranes are found within the ventral cavity. Like I said before, the dorsal cavity is lined with the meninges, but we'll talk about that in chapter 13 and so on. But this ventral cavity is lined by the serous membranes. Serous membranes can be a little confusing. And this little guy up here, this online interactive talks about serous membranes also. So if you're confused, that is pretty helpful. So our serous membranes are going to be layers of tissue that are going to line our cavity and also wrap around the organs. So the parietal layer is going to line the internal surface of the body wall. So it basically like lines the inside of your chest. Let's say it lines the inside of your chest, whereas the visceral layer is it reflects back and it covers the external surface of the organs. And another name for organs is viscera. So that's why visceral, think it's covering the organs. And so it covers the heart, it covers the lungs, it covers the stomach, and so on. And in between there, so there's going to be a space in between the parietal and the visceral layer, and that's called the serous cavity, and it's filled with serous fluid. And so these layers of serous membranes are each going to secrete this serous fluid, and the serous fluid is going to be important because it's going to lubricate the different, it's going to lubricate in between these two different layers. And so it's going to make it so that like every time your heart beats, there's enough lubrication that it doesn't, like, it's not sticky. So if the parietal and visceral serous membranes were inflamed and they, like, say stuck together, there wasn't enough serous fluid, and like every time your heart beat they were sticking together and there was friction and it was getting hot and sticky, it would be really uncomfortable and not very good for you. So the serous fluid acts as a lubricant and reduces that friction. Right, this is also important in the abdominal cavity where all of your, intestines are going to be moving around and moving your, undergoing peristalsis and pushing all of the ingesta through your abdominal cavity. So here's the ventral cavity here's the dorsal cavity, and then we can see this is going to be a representation of the serous membranes. So you can imagine it as if you had a balloon, right? And this balloon, let's say it's not that full, so it's kind of has some extra space in it, and you take your fist and you stuff it inside the balloon, just like here. So the outer layer of the balloon here is like the parietal layer of the serous membrane. It's lining the cavity. And a good way to think of this is as the heart. So imagine that this hand here is the heart, because like the heart is similar in size. So we'll say this is the lining of the pericardium, right? It's lining the cavity. Then the serous membrane actually reflects back and it curves back. It's all really one main layer. But the part that is covering the organ is called the visceral layer of the serous membrane. And then the part in between, this is the serous cavity. Then that should be filled with serous fluid. Usually there's not quite this much serous fluid in it, but it's a good example. So let's go back up here. We have the thoracic cavity first, which is part of the ventral cavity. And so it also has some serous membranes. So we're going to talk about what's located within the thoracic cavity. So we can see that we've got a couple of subcavities in the thoracic cavity that we need to learn about. So we have these guys here. The lungs are in the pleural cavity. And then in the middle, between the two lungs, we have what's called the mediastinum. And we can see here in yellow. And that mediastinum is actually going to surround the heart. And it also, so like the esophagus is going to go through here, the trachea goes through here, the great vessels are going to go through here. So a lot of different things go through the mediastinum. And then we also have the pericardial cavity, which is kind of within the mediastinum in between the two lungs. So the mediastinum, once again, is that median middle space in the thoracic cavity. And the pericardium is going to be specifically the subcavity that surrounds and houses the heart. So peri means around, cardium means heart. So pericardium, it's around the heart. The parietal pericardium, right? Remember, parietal means it lines the body cavity. So the parietal pericardium is the outer layer, and it lines the pericardial cavity and it forms the sac around the heart. The visceral pericardium, remember viscera means organ, is the part that is directly attached to and covers the organ. So it covers the heart. And then the pericardial cavity is the space between the parietal and visceral layers that contains the serous fluid. So this serous fluid, we can call it the, serous fluid of the pericardial cavity, or we can call it the pericardial fluid. Next, we have the pleura. And so the pleural cavity is this guy right here. The pleural cavity is going to be, we have one on either side, one for the right and one for the left lung. So the lungs are going to be found in the pleural cavities. It also has those associated serous membranes. So the parietal pleura lines the pleural cavity. So it's going to line the inside of that thoracic wall, whereas the visceral pleura is going to cover the outside of the lungs. And then the pleural cavity is the space between them, and it's filled with pleural fluid, which is that serous fluid. Now, both pleural fluid and pericardial fluid, and what we'll later talk about the fluid in the abdomen, these fluids can be important. We can sample these fluids clinically and look at them and see, especially if there's too much of them. So you might have too much pericardial fluid or too much pleural fluid. And so this pleural effusion, or this too much buildup of pleural fluid, is usually a sign that something is wrong. So we can take, stick a needle in there and take some of this fluid and look at it under the microscope and see, are there, bacteria in there? Are there cancer cells in there? Are there antibodies to certain diseases, or do we see blood? So we can kind of look at that and try to figure out what's wrong. So here we see the heart, and this is the visceral pericardium is right here connected to the heart, and the parietal pericardium is lining that pericardial cavity. Then with our pleura, we've got the visceral pleura that is right against the surface of the lungs, and the parietal pleura that's going to be right outside. So next we have the abdominopelvic cavity. And remember that the diaphragm is going to be this muscle here, muscular organ is going to be dividing the thoracic cavity from the abdominal cavity. It's really important that there's no air or fluid movement between them, so it's totally divided. But our abdominopelvic cavity, there is nothing dividing the abdominal cavity from the pelvic cavity, so our organs are kind of free to move between these two cavities. So the abdominal cavity is the superior area, and it contains most of the digestive system organs and the kidneys, the ureters, things like that. And it's going to be pretty open, right? Because our belly doesn't have any it's not very protected. But it's also because there's no bone encasing it, it's going to allow, especially in females, it allows for pregnancy. Our pelvic cavity is more inferior, and it's kind of between the hip bones, and it's kind of within that pelvic area where your pelvis is going to be a little bit protecting. And it contains the last part of the large intestine, the distal part, the last or distal part of the ureters, the urinary bladder, and the reproductive organs. So you can see here, this is going to be the abdominopelvic cavity. We'll kind of talk about them together because there's no actual dividing line. And so the organs of the abdominopelvic cavity and the abdominopelvic cavity itself is going to be lined with what's called the peritoneum. And the peritoneum is the name for the serous membranes of the abdominopelvic cavity. So the parietal peritoneum is the outer layer. It lines the internal walls of that abdominopelvic cavity, right? So it's going to line the outer layer. The visceral peritoneum is going to cover the organs, right? So it's going to cover the stomach, and it's going to cover the small intestines and the large intestines. And then the peritoneal cavity is the space between them, and it's filled with that peritoneal fluid, or serous fluid of the peritoneal cavity. So we can see here that this is going to be the parietal pericardium here. And then this is the visceral pericardium, the part that goes around your intestines and things. And then all of this blue part here is going to be the pericardial cavity or pericardial space, and it's usually filled with, peritoneal fluid. You might notice that some organs here, like this organ, the bladder, is covered by the visceral peritoneum, and it's an organ that's called retroperitoneal, and the kidneys are like that too, and the pancreas up here. So they're kind of behind the peritoneum, and we'll cover that more in 169. So just know that the parietal peritoneum generally lines the cavity, whereas the visceral peritoneum is going to cover the organs. And then the fluid that, the space in between is called the peritoneal cavity, and it's filled with peritoneal fluid. And this is another thing that if we have too much peritoneal fluid, we can stick a needle in there and look at that fluid and kind of figure out why, and see if there's bacteria in it, see if there's, maybe we had a perforating ulcer and there's some like stomach contents in there, which might not be very healthy. If there's blood, if there's cancer cells, see if there's inflammation, things like that. So we have a whole bunch of organs that we've talked about inside all of these different cavities, but we can't really, generally, we're not going to be, in order to find more out about these, we're not going to cut the person open usually, but we might want to take some images, take some medical images. And when we do that, when we look at these medical images, or if we actually were going to cut a person open or like slice a person, we're going to be looking at what we call sections and planes. And so a section is an actual cut or slice that exposes internal anatomies. So if we were dissecting someone and like cutting them up, if you went to the bodies exhibit and you saw the different slices, that would be a section, right? This is an actual cut. And we don't really do that as often, especially if the person's still alive. So we're going to talk more about planes usually. Some of our models are going to be cut, right? So they're actually, actual models that are cut into these sections. Planes are imaginary flat surfaces that pass through the body. And these planes are going to be like where, if you were going to cut the body, where would you cut? And we can actually get X-ray images or CT images or MRI images of these planes. And so it looks like we actually cut the body open, but we didn't have to, right? We could use an X-ray or something instead. So that's good. We don't really want to cut most of our patients open unless, we have to do surgery. And then we're not going to be like totally chopping them in half. So we have 3 different main planes that we'll talk about. So the coronal or frontal plane is going to be a vertical plane that divides the body into anterior, right, or front, and posterior or back parts. And it's going to be right here. Next, we have our transverse plane, which is also known as a cross-sectional plane or a horizontal plane. And so that's going to be a plane that divides the body into superior or upper and inferior or lower planes. So let's look at these. So the coronal plane is this purple one here, and it's dividing the body into a front and a back half, right? Or an anterior and posterior half. The transverse plane or the cross-sectional plane is this orange one here, and it's dividing the body into an upper and a lower plane. And we can have a bunch of these planes. So these are not the only ones. So we can have a transverse plane here, or a transverse plane here, or another one up here. We have a bunch of different planes. The other plane that we'll talk about is called the sagittal plane, and that's that green one here. And the sagittal plane is going to be dividing the body into right and left halves. If we divide the body directly in half along midline into right and left halves, it's going to be called the mid-sagittal plane or median plane. And that divides the body into equal right and left halves. So this picture here is showing a mid-sagittal plane, right, because it's running right along the middle. Any plane that passes through the structure at an angle we call an oblique plane. And that just means that it's one that's not quite the same. So if any of you are like math inclined and you want to think, you can think of these as like the X, Y, and Z axis, right? And so that they're all going to be at 90-degree angles to each other. As I said before, this is important because when we look at medical images, a lot of these images are obtained by going through these planes. And so right here, we see these images here. And like if you were going to get an MRI, you might see these images. And this image looks as if we chopped the head in half, like we chopped the top off the head. So it looks like we divided the head into upper and lower, in superior and inferior parts. And so it's a transverse section because it looks as if we would have had, if we were actually chopping that person up, we would have had to chop the head off and divided them into upper and lower parts. And so this is a transverse section. This image here where we can see this like profile look where you can see the nose, that's like a mid-sagittal section. And so like in order to see that, we would have had to like actually chop the person in half, but thankfully we can just take an X-ray or an MRI and get this type of picture too. But this is going to be a mid-sagittal section or plane. And finally this one right here where it looks like we've kind of chopped right down through here, right through you can see the eyeballs over here, the orbits, even the brain up here. This is going to be a coronal or frontal section. And so it's really kind of important to be able to relate what these planes and sections are so we can sort of understand what these images look like and how how they're oriented. It can take a little while to start understanding medical imaging. And we can look at this too. So let's say this is our, some of our intestines inside. And we can take different planes through these. Especially this is if you're going to like be doing a CT or of the abdomen maybe, or if you're even looking with an ultrasound, you're going to see some of these different structures. So if we cut right through here, with this plane, it would look like a circle. But if we cut through here with this oblique plane, it would look like a much longer circle. So, if we cut through here, it would look like a U. So as you can tell, it can be a little bit complicated. But any plane that is not one of these, one of the three cardinal planes that we talked about at 90-degree angles to each other, if it's a sideways plane over here, it's called an oblique plane. So we said, medical imaging often is going to show us the images that look like what would happen if you had cut through the body. So these both of them right here, it looks like we've chopped the top of the head off, right? So that's going to be a transverse plane. So we've gotten these images from the transverse plane. This one here, it kind of looks like we chopped the head in half. So this is more of a sagittal plane over here. This one's a little bit more complicated, but we can see it's a sonography, right? So this is the little baby right here. Ultrasound images are, I think, a little bit more complicated to grasp. But these, especially when we're looking at radiographs or CTs or MRIs, you can kind of, it helps to understand a little bit about planes. So you will need to be able to differentiate between the different planes. And I've got some pictures of models, and I'm going to ask you, like, what plane of section was this cut on? So, next, I'm going to be talking about abdominopelvic regions and quadrants. And so remember that we talked about the abdominopelvic cavity and how it has all these organs in it, like all the digestive organs and the reproductive organs and the urinary organs. And so because of that, in order to make it a little bit easier, we can divide it. And so using planes, right? So we can divide it into 9 different regions. So this would be like a sagittal plane. This would be a sagittal plane. These would be transverse planes. But it can be divided into 9 compartments. And these 9 compartments are each going to house different organs. And so if we really got down to it and you said, that the pain was coming from the hypogastric region, well then maybe, maybe it's the bladder because that's where the hypogastric region is. Or if the pain was coming from the right hypochondriac region, well maybe it's the liver because that's really mostly what's up there. So it's useful to be able to localize pain and to know which organs are in which quadrant or which region. And you will have, your lab manual has a practice activity for this. So this one, it seems complicated, but it's not as bad. If you look here, the right and the left mirror each other. And this brings me to one other important point, and I did not mention it earlier because I forgot, but think about anatomic right and left. So if we are looking at this patient and he is looking at us, remember that his left hand is on your right side, right? Because it's going to be opposite. Whenever we say right or left, we're always talking about the patient's or the model's right or left. So this is this guy over here, this is his right hypochondriac region, even if when we look at it, it's kind of on our left side. So when you are labeling something, make sure that you're labeling it from the patient's perspective. So remember anatomic right and left. So this is the right hypochondriac region, the right lumbar region, the right iliac region. Then on the other side, we have the left hypochondriac region, the left lumbar region, and the left iliac region. So they're easy because they are, they're the same names, just right and left, but sometimes you might get confused. Remember that it is the patient's right that we are labeling, not your own. So it's going to be the opposite if you're looking at them. Now in the middle, we have the epigastric region, right? Epi means sort of on top of, around, and gastric is stomach. And so, right, this is the area around the stomach, right, or near the stomach. The stomach is right up here in that epigastric region. The umbilical region, and this is going to be centered on the umbilicus. So the umbilicus is like right here, or the belly button, right? So the umbilical region is centered on the umbilicus. And then the hypogastric region, right, hypo is below. It's below the stomach. It's like the lowest region. All right, then next we have the easier one is the abdominal pelvic quadrants. And so this is maybe a little bit more likely to be used. Say, you know, you have stomach pain and you call the ambulance, they're going to come and say, where does it hurt? And you'll point here and they'll say the right lower quadrant, or, you know, the left lower quadrant. You can localize it to one of these quadrants. And it's actually a little bit more commonly to use this one than it is to use these, especially when you're first localizing it. So once again, remember your anatomic right and left. So we have our right upper quadrant, right? It's got like the liver and the gallbladder. Our left upper quadrant has got more of the stomach in it. The left lower quadrant is going to have your left, you know, ovaries and such if you are a female. The right lower quadrant, right, is gonna have like the right ovary and stuff. We also have the appendix is over here. So this is going to be, and this part right here goes right through the umbilicus. So it is divided with a mid-sagittal and a transverse plane right through the umbilicus. So this is just some questions. You can go, what did you learn? There's some more practice questions for you. And then finally, we mentioned these organ systems already in lecture, but I wanted to go over them again here because in this lab, I want you guys to kind of learn about the general names of the organs. And so they're listed in your lab manual, which organs to know. So I want you guys to know which organs they are and kind of where they're located in the body. And so I might ask you, like, what is this organ and what cavity is it located in? You know, maybe it's the heart and it's located in the pericardial cavity. So this is, obviously we're not learning about all of these organ systems yet, but I do want you to kind of in general know what the organs are so that when we do get to those organ systems, you're aware of them and you say, oh, that's the kidney. I remember I learned that already. So you'll be that far ahead. So make sure you look over all the different organs and organ systems in APR. All right, and that is it for this lab.